Hey guys, welcome to the channel. This is the third part of What If Issei Was Broken Beyond Repair. Before I start, please do support for more awesome content and subscribe my channel and like the video, and also share this video with your friends. Let's start the video. Issei left the old warehouse and headed towards the church. It was time to save his friend. And mercy was not going to be an option. Haha hey hey, so, you finally begin to accept what you are. Perfect, this is going to be enjoyable. The voice said. Issei only shook his head. No matter how many times that voice told him to accept who he is, he'll always just keep ignoring it. But he also knew that it was something that he couldn't keep up. At some point, he's going to fall. Issei looked slightly up and saw that he had arrived at the church. He stopped walking and looked down at his hands. That dream from last night was still inside his head. Suddenly, an image flashed inside Issei's mind. He saw that he had bloodied hands. He looked down and saw the man with white hair, on the ground dead. He was the same as he was inside his dream. Clerical clothing, a deep hole at the top of his head, and his brain was inside his ears and mouth. Issei shook his head. A hand automatically went up to his face. He gritted his teeth and began to breathe heavily. After a few seconds, his hand left his face and his pacey breathing stopped, returning to a more calming one. It was time. Time to get revenge. He looked behind him and gave a small sigh. Of course they would follow him. Oh well, it looks like he'll just have to pretend that they're not there. Are you ready, partner? Ddrag asked out loud. Issei only nodded. He started to walk forwards. He stopped at the front door and put hand on his chin. How should he approach this? Silently or loud and stupid? He decided to play it silently, but he doesn't know how long he'll be able to keep it up. He gave 2 knocks on the door and waited. After a minute, the door opened, revealing a man with short black hair and brown eyes. He had a small beard on his face and he had a sleepy expression. What do you want? The man asked. Issei took the opportunity to look inside the church a bit. It was a normal church and it was the same as any other church. Chandeliers on the ceiling, wooden chairs that went all the way to the cross that was in the middle of the church. He couldn't see anything else, since it was too dark. Look kid, if you want to pray to God, then you should wait until the morning. Sniff sniff, wait a second, why do you smell like Devi? The man was cut off when Issei suddenly grabbed his throat and pulled him towards him. He put his entire arm over his neck and his other hand went to his mouth. The man tried to scream, but his screams were cut out by Issei's hand over his mouth. After a small while, Issei heard a snap and the man went limp in his arms. Issei let his body fall to the ground. Issei then entered the church and closed the door behind him. He walked forwards, but stopped when he heard a loud voice. Yahoo! Yahoo! Hello shitty devil! Have you come here to die by my hand? Please tell me you did. The man said, coming out of a room behind a painting. Issei looked at the man weirdly, but then realized who it was. It was the man with the white hair and the red eyes. Ah, I'll take your silence for a yes. But before I cut you down with my sword, I'll let my name haunt you. My name is Fried Salzan. Fried screamed as he dashed at Issei with his sword raised. Issei's eyes widened at the familiar words. Remember my name. My name is Kokobil. He heard Kokobil's voice in his head. Issei gritted his teeth in anger. He looked up and saw Fried's body start to change. His hair changed from white to black. It was also longer. His eyes became redder. His clothing changed as well. Though Issei couldn't see most of it, he saw that he had a black robe. That's right. The man that was dashing towards Issei was none other than Kokobil. What's wrong, Red Dragon Emperor? Are you shocked to see me? Or are you afraid? The second one sounds more reasonable, since I was the one that created every single scar that's on your face. Kokobil shouted with a big grin on his face, as he came closer to Issei. Issei clenched both his hands into fists and gritted his teeth hard, almost breaking them. Issei suddenly looked at Kokobil with fire in his one eye. Once Kokobil was close enough, Issei punched him with all of his strength, shattering his jaw. Kokobil fell down, screaming and dropping his sword. He was rolling around, holding his now broken jaw. You fucking human. How dare you do this to me? Kokobil shouted at the top of his lungs. He has never experienced this much pain before. Issei approached him and started to stomp down on the back of his head. Each time Kokobil tried to crawl away, Issei just pulled him back. After a few powerful stomps, a deep hole was now visible at the top of his head. Issei then turned him around so he was facing him. He mounted on top of him and started to punch his face. One punch. Blood. Two punches. Even more blood. Each punch was coming stronger than the other. Partner, stop. He's dead. Partner, snap out of it. Issei heard Diedrag's voice. He blinked and then looked down. Kokobeel's body was now replaced by Fred's. Fred was dead. Just like in his dream, there was a big hole at the top of his head. But, Issei did a little bit more damage. He saw that from all the punches, Fred's face was unrecognizable. His left eye was missing from its socket and a few parts of his face revealed his skull. Was he having a hallucination? He could have sworn that he was fighting Kokobeel. Issei sighed. He stood up and looked around again. He noticed that behind the painting that Fred came from was a staircase. He saw it as he walked closer. He then heard movement coming from the stairs. Issei narrowed his eyes. From his dreams, he remembered that there were a few bodies from exorcists. He took a few steps back and waited. It didn't take long for them to show up. Issei looked at them and counted that there were about 20 or so. One of them dashed forwards at Issei, screaming. Issei saw him and caught his sword with his bare hand, shocking him. Issei managed to tear the sword away from the exorcist. Issei then used that sword to stab him in the stomach. The exorcist fell down on the ground alive, but not for long. Another two charged at Issei. One of them tried to slash Issei across the face, but Issei easily dodged. He then grabbed the arm of the exorcist that tried to attacking. He blocked an incoming sword from another exorcist. He kicked the one that he blocked in the stomach, sending him a few feet away. He then stabbed the one that he was holding in his chest. He quickly ducked another exorcist's sword. He quickly sidestepped to the side and grabbed the top of his head. He turned his head to the right with force, breaking his neck. Suddenly, Issei was grabbed from behind by another exorcist. Another one stood in front of him, ready to strike with his sword. Issei elbowed the exorcist in the liver, making him let go of him. Issei quickly sidestepped away from the exorcist that was holding him, since the other exorcist was about to swing his sword. And he did. On his ally's shoulder. Issei blocked the punches of an exorcist, but then Issei sent a powerful one of his own. Despite the exorcist's attempt to block the punch, it broke his arms. Issei then stomped on his face. Another one dashed at him. Issei easily dodged the attack. He then grabbed the hand that the exorcist was holding the sword. Issei used his power and stabbed the exorcist with his own hand and sword, killing him. Issei was starting to grow impatient, since he didn't have much time. So he decided to end this fight quickly. He extended his hand forwards. Flames came out of his hands, burning a few exorcists. Issei stopped firing his flames and looked at the exorcists that were left alive. They were staring at him with fear in their eyes. Issei started to approach them slowly. They all came back from their frightening thoughts and ran away from Issei. Stay away from us, you monster. One of them screamed. Unknown by the retreating exorcists, Issei flinched at being called a monster. Naturally, he wouldn't care. But since that dream he saw last night, the word, monster, became some kind of a cursed word for him. Issei then started to walk towards the door painting. He stopped however when he saw the cross in the middle of the room. He looked at it with hatred. He remembered what Asia told him. She didn't have any friends just because she was the Holy Maiden and just because she healed an injured devil, God exiled her. So he did what he thought was right. He walked towards the cross and placed his hands on it. Smoke started to come out from the wooden cross. When Issei backed up from the cross, Issei now looked at the cross which was slowly beginning to light up in flames. For those who are Christian and have read this part, please know that I'm Christian as well. I didn't do it because I hate Christians or God. I believe in God and Jesus and I hope that I didn't offend anyone with this part. Just know that I did it for the sake of the story. If you tell me to delete that part, then I'll do it. Thank you. He shook his head and walked towards the painting. He opened the hidden door and walked down the stairs. When he reached the bottom, he saw a wooden door with a small window. Issei kicked the door open, easily breaking its hinges. Issei looked around the room that he was in. It looked like he was in a section in the catacombs of Paris, except that there weren't any skulls around. He looked in front of him and saw that there were 3 fallen angels, looking at him. 2 of them were women and one of them is Danasik. He then looked up at the wall where his eyes widened. He saw Asia, chained on the wall. But there was something different about her. Her whole body was limp. Her eyes were open, but they had no life in it. Issei then realized something. He was too late. He felt like a part of him died as he saw Asia chained to the wall, lifeless. He took a small step forwards. Che. You're too late, kid. We have already extracted her sacred gear. She's already dead. Danasik said with a smirk. The two female fallen angels approached Issei with grins. What do you say, Calawarner? Shall we get rid of this human scum? The short girl said. Issei took a small glance at her. He saw that she was wearing a gothic Lolita attire, which consisted of a black Lolita dress with white frills, a large black bow on the front, and a green jewel embedded on the collar, white thigh-high socks, and black shoes. She also wore a large black bow on top of her hair. She also had blue eyes and twin tails. Issei then took another small glance to the other girl. Her attire consisted of a violet, trenchcoat-like top with a wide collar, a matching miniskirt, and black-heeled shoes. The trenchcoat top was open at her chest, giving view to her breasts and cleavage. She also wore a gold necklace around her neck. She also had long, navy blue hair that obscured her right eye and brown eyes. Yes, let's Mittelt. Master Kokobile will be pleased. Calawarner said with a smirk, summoning her yellow light spear. Issei lost her at, Kokobile will be pleased. So, Kokobile sent them. He'll remember to keep one alive then. Or two. Mittelt then summoned her pink spear. She threw it at Issei. What made her smirk widen, was that Issei didn't make an effort to move. Once the light spear touched Issei, it shattered and disappeared. Mittelt's eyes widened. Though Calawarner and Danasik grinned at her. See Mittelt, you are the weakest link. In terms of power, I am the strongest. Calawarner said proudly, causing Mittelt and Danasik to glare at her. What makes you think that you're the strongest one? Danasik said with narrowed eyes. Simple, in every sparring match that we had, I beat you both. The only one that came close to beating me was Rainer. Speaking of her, what happened to her? The last time I saw her, was when she was about to take out that human that was supposed to be the host of the Red Dragon Emperor. Calawarner said. Ah, so you were indeed allies of the fallen Rainer. A voice said. This caused the Mittelt and Calawarner to look around the room. Danasik looked at the arm of Issei in curiosity. What are you talking about, Red Dragon Emperor? Danasik asked, shocking the other two fallen. Wait, this kid is the host of the Red Dragon Emperor. And you knew all along. Calawarner shouted. Shut up. What did you mean by that, Red Dragon Emperor? Danasik asked once more. You are right, the fallen Rainer approached my host. During their small walk, Rainer revealed herself as a fallen and threw her light spear at my host. Once she realized that my host was not affected by her attacks, she tried to flee. But, my partner quickly caught up to her. Let's just say, we enjoyed watching her squirm while my partner choked the life out of her. Diedrag said. You son of a bitch. Calawarner screamed as she dashed at Issei. Issei sighed. This was going to be way too easy. He karate chopped Calawarner on her neck. She fell on the stone floor, unconscious. One down, two left. Mittelt widened her eyes and took a few steps back. She felt someone behind her. She turned around and saw Danasik, looking at her with a smirk. He pushed her at Issei with all his power. Her body collided with Issei's. She looked up and saw him staring at her with a scary look in his eye. Before she could react, Issei kneed her in her solar plexus, cutting her air supply. In a few seconds, she too fell unconscious. Sigh. Well, this is what you get for trusting women to do a man's job. I'll take it from here. And believe me, I won't be as easy as those two. Danasik said with a grin on his face. Danasik took his fighting stance and summoned a blue light spear in his right arm. Issei, seeing this, disappeared. Danasik's eyes widened as he looked around the room for any sign of Issei. Danasik then felt a hand on his shoulder. He was spun forcefully around and saw Issei. Issei already summoned his boosted gear in his right hand, and it was with the same hand that he punched Danasik. Danasik fell to the ground, holding his right cheek where Issei punched him. Issei picked him up from the ground and threw him towards the wall Asia was chained to. Once Danasik fell to the ground, he looked up and saw Issei approaching him slowly. He tried to stand up, but Issei grabbed him by the throat. Issei head-butted him, breaking his skull. Issei grabbed his throat once more and threw him at the other side of the room. Danasek's body stopped rolling at the front of the now broken door that Issei kicked open. He desperately began trying to crawl away, trying to escape Issei's fury. He felt two hands grab both of his legs, pulling him away from the exit. Issei turned him around and shoved both of his thumbs into Danasek's eyes. Danasek screamed as Issei shoved his thumbs deeper and deeper into his skull. Issei then pushed his thumbs deeper. Danasek's body went limp. Issei pulled his thumbs back and looked at them. He saw that both of Danasek's eyeballs were on his thumbs. Issei pulled them off his thumbs and threw them on the ground. Issei looked back and saw Asia's body. It was still the same, lifeless. Issei then looked at Danasek's body and saw a green glow coming from one of his fingers. Once he got closer, it looked like a ring with a green jewel on top. He pulled the ring off Danasek's finger and looked at it closely. Partner, that is Asia's sacred gear, Twilight Healing. I suggest we give it to her. I'm sorry, partner. I'm sorry that we didn't make it in time. Ddraig apologized to his host. But Issei stopped listening when Ddraig said that it was her sacred gear. He tore the chains that chained Asia on the wall. He slung her over his shoulder and started to walk to the set of stairs. Wait, partner. What about the two fallen that you left alive? Aren't we going to question them? Ddraig asked. Issei stopped walking and looked back at the two unconscious fallen. He lightly let Asia on the floor and walked over to the two fallen. He slugged both of them over his shoulders while he carried Asia bridal style. He walked up the steps and saw the orc waiting. They didn't seem to notice him. Issei looked at the cross that he burnt, which was now just a piece of burnt wood. Issei. He heard the voice of Rias. He looked at her and saw her running at him. Issei, are you alright? They didn't hurt you, did they? Rias asked. Issei shook his head. He then pushed Asia's dead body towards her. Rias grabbed the dead nun and looked at Issei with confusion. Issei then gave her Twilight Healing, causing Rias to widen her eyes. Issei then walked past her carrying the two fallen still. He went past Akano, Kaneko and Kiba. Issei, wait. Rias shouted as she turned around. But by the time, Issei was already gone. With Issei unlocked his door and entered his house. He opened the lights. Issei dropped the bodies of the two fallen on his couch. Partner, I know what you're thinking. Don't do it. Ddraig pleaded his host, but Issei ignored him. He opened his fridge and grabbed a big bottle of beer. Issei took the lid off and began to drink from the bottle. Hey, that's right, continue to go deeper and deeper into your depression. You will go even deeper, and as time goes by, they will realize that you are too far gone. The voice said. Issei, though, ignored it as well. Because he finally understood what those lyrics meant. When real life is hard on you, the only happiness that you have left is inside a bottle. Happiness, straight from the bottle. When real life's too hard to swallow. Calawarner's eyes fluttered open. Her vision was a little hazy, but once she looked around the room that she was in, her vision cleared. She was lying down on a couch. She looked to her left and saw Mittelt as well, but she was still asleep. Pissed, Mittelt. Wake up. She whispered to her comrade, but Mittelt wasn't waking up. Calawarner looked behind her and her eyes widened slightly. In the kitchen, she saw Issei. Though he was asleep, she could see that there were around 15 bottles of alcohol on the table. His face was on the table, so she couldn't see it. She looked back at Mittelt. She gave a tired sigh. She slapped her in the face, successfully waking her up. Ow. Calawarner, what the hell was that faux mph? Mittelt began shouting, but she was cut off when Calawarner placed her left hand on her mouth, shutting her up. Shish. Mittelt, shut up. Look over there. Calawarner said, pointing at Issei. Once Mittelt looked at the direction she was pointing, her eyes widened a bit. It's that darn kid that knocked both of us out. Mittelt whispered. Yes, I remember. But what happened to Danasek? Calawarner asked with a raised brow. Who cares about him? Right now, we should figure a way to get out of here. Mittelt said. Calawarner nodded in agreement. She looked around the room once more. She noticed that the door wasn't that far from where they were. Mittelt, we're gonna try and walk over to that door. Make sure that you don't make a single sound. Calawarner said. Okay, but shouldn't we kill him first? I mean, he's asleep. It will be an easy kill for us. Mittelt said with a smirk on her face. Calawarner looked at Issei for a moment. She then looked away and turned her attention at the door. He's not worth it. Come on, let's get out of here. Calawarner said. But why not? Mittelt asked with a raised brow. Kalawarner did not answer immediately, since the reason was also unknown for her. Let's just get out of here, she said again. Mittelt sighed, dropping the subject for now. A light fine. But don't expect me to forget about it. But what are we going to do if the door is locked? Mittelt asked. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Now come on, Kalawarner said, standing up from the couch. Mittelt followed. They slowly began to make their way towards the door. Once they reached the door, Kalawarner slowly reached out to grab the knob of the door. She slowly turned it. Shit. It's locked, Kalawarner said with a frown. Here, let me try something, Mittelt said, pulling out a small nail. Where did you get that? And when did you learn how to picklock doors? Kalawarner asked with a raised brow. Plot convenience, Mittelt said casually. What? Kalawarner asked. Oh, nothing, Mittelt said quickly. Kalawarner looked at Mittelt weirdly. She then shrugged her shoulders and waited for her to unlock the door. Suddenly, they heard someone clear their throat. They both paled. Slowly and shakily, they both turned around. Issei was now awake. He was staring at them with a sleepy expression. He had dark circles under his eyes, meaning that he was drinking until almost morning. He was also a little pale. His left eye was kinda red, which meant that he was crying at some point. He was also holding a bottle that was filled with beer in his right hand. Issei looked at the two fallen with an emotionless face. He rubbed his eyes and looked at them with a face that said, "Where do you think you two are going?" Gee, good morning, kid. Did you sleep well? Kalawarner said in a shaky voice. Issei looked at her, but didn't nod nor shake his head. He slowly began to approach the two fallen, which were now backed against the door. Once Issei got close enough, he grabbed the pick from Mittelt's hand and snapped it in two. He threw it on the ground and continued to stare at the two fallen. Finally, Issei gave a tired sigh and slowly walked away from the two fallen. They both gave a sigh of relief, knowing that he wouldn't do anything right now. Issei went to the couch that the two fallen were sleeping and sat down. He looked down at the bottle in his hand. He put the bottle to his lips and took a big swig. After a few seconds, the beer bottle was now empty. He looked at the bottle for a moment. He let it slip out of his hands, falling to the floor, but not breaking. The two fallen stared at Issei. They didn't know what to do. What do you want us here? Also, why did you keep us alive? What happened to Danasik? Mittelt asked. Issei broke out of his small drunken state and looked at the two fallen. The reason as to why we kept the two of you alive is because we want to learn what Kokobil is planning and where he is. We want you here so you can give us that information. And about your other friend, he had joined Rainer in the afterlife. Diedrag said, surprising the two fallen with his sudden appearance. Once they sank in what Diedrag said, they both looked at each other. What if we refuse to tell you anything? Kalawarner asked with gritted teeth. Asterisk chuckle, that is an answer that you both already know. But, I'll tell you. It's death, of course. Diedrag said with a chuckle. Both Kalawarner and Mittelt flinched at the mention of death. But, since my partner is in a drunken state, he'll make this as slow and painful as he can. So good luck, Diedrag said. Both the fallen could just feel the grin behind his voice. Once Diedrag's voice went quiet, Issei stood up. At that point, Mittelt and Kalawarner already had their light spears in hand. But, there weren't any smirks on their faces. As Issei took a step forward, they took a step back. Resisting is futile. Can't you see that you're making things difficult for yourselves? You should just give up and give us that information. Me and my partner can both assure you that we will let you live if you give us that information. Diedrag said. Both the girls looked at each other and thought of their options. They both retracted their light spears and looked at the floor. Can you give us some time to think about it? Kalawarner asked. I wish we were able to do that. But we can't. We need an answer here and now. But, we'll help you come to a decision. Kokobil, one of the leaders of the fallen angels, what does he think about each and every single one of you? Diedrag asked. The question caused Kalawarner and Mittelt to widen their eyes. He thinks of us as allies. Kalawarner said. Really now? Tell me one time that he thanked you because you did something for him. What about the last time that he asked if you were alright? Face it, you answered because you didn't want to accept the truth that he only thinks of you as mere puppets, hoping for them to do his bidding in order to achieve his ultimate goal. And once he achieves it, I bet that he'll throw all of you aside like you were nothing. Diedrag said coldly. By this point, Mittelt was now looking down, tears going down her cheeks. Kalawarner had the same expression, but she wasn't crying. I know that the truth hurts, but you two are going to find out about it sooner or later. Now, dry your tears and tell us what you decided. Diedrag said. Mittelt nodded and wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her shirt. Kalawarner looked up. We'll tell you everything that we know, though it's not much. Kalawarner said. Issei nodded and waited for her to continue. From what we heard, Kokobil is going to come to this town. We don't know the exact day, but we know that it's going to be soon. Another thing that he's hoping to do whilst in this town is to start another great war between the three factions. That is all we know. Kalawarner said. Issei narrowed his eyes at Kokobil's plans. Diedrag has mentioned the great war between the three factions, but he didn't know much. Partner, if Kokobil succeeds in starting another great war, then it could mean the end of all of humanity. Diedrag said. Issei widened his eyes. So, now that we told you everything that we know, what is going to happen to us? Mittelt asked. Since we know what Kokobil is planning, then you two are free to go. But I would advise you going back to the church. Diedrag said. That was where we were planning to go. Mittelt said. Good. But, before you go, let me make a small proposal for the two of you. Diedrag said. That two fallen looked at Issei with raised brows. You two could help us out when we fight against Kokobil. You could prove valuable allies. Diedrag proposed his offer to the two fallen. The two fallen looked at Issei in surprise. Mittelt looked to be thinking. Just promise us one thing. Kalawarner said. Issei looked at her, prompting her to continue. You won't throw us aside. Also, could I make an offer? Kalawarner asked. Mittelt looked at her friend in confusion. Issei raised his brow at her. But nonetheless, he nodded. Since I don't want to go that dirty old church, I was wondering if we could both live here from now on. Kalawarner said, a bit of red on her cheeks. Mittelt looked shocked at what Kalawarner proposed. She also went a little red. Issei looked at her, surprised. He put a hand on his chin, thinking if he should accept or not. Accept, partner. I don't think that they'll be a threat to us. Diedrag said inside his head. Issei was expecting Diedrag to reject the offer, but he was now even more surprised that he was willing to let two fallen angels live with them. Don't listen to that dragon, he's making you weak, he's making you soft, the same goes with the devils, the voice said. Issei gritted his teeth at the voice. He snapped back in reality once he heard Mittelt snapping her fingers in front of him. Yo, you still with us? She asked. Issei sent her a glare, which made her back off. Issei then looked at Kalawarner and sighed. He then nodded his head. You're allowing us to stay? She asked. Issei nodded again. Thank you so much. Kalawarner said with a smile. Issei just waved her off, meaning that, it was nothing. Partner, look at the time. You're late for school. Diedrag said to his partner. Issei looked at the clock on the wall and saw that it was 12:36 o'clock. He was basically 2 hours late. Issei yawned and lazily went to get his bag. He was already in his school uniform from yesterday. Though it was a little dirty, he decided to wear it just for today. You two stay here. We'll be back in a few hours. Also, don't open the door to anyone. My partner has a spare key. Diedrag said. The two fallen nodded and made their way to the couch. They sat down and opened the TV. Issei grabbed his spare key and exited his house. He locked the door and started walking slowly to school. By the time that he got there, it was lunch time. He went through the gate and started to walk towards the old school building. Why were you late? A female voice said. Issei looked in front of his and saw two girls walking towards him. The one on the right has a slim figure, black hair styled in a short bob cut and violet eyes that were behind glasses. She was wearing the Kuo Academy girl uniform. The one on her left has long straight black hair that extends all the way down to her knees with split bangs and light brown eyes that were behind a pair of glasses as well. She was also wearing her school uniform. Once the girl on the right took a good look of Issei, she said. Oh, you're the new member of the Occult Research Club. Rias told me a lot about you. My name is Sona Citri and this here is Tsubaki Shinra. Pleased to meet you in person. Sona said with a polite bow, Tsubaki doing the same. Issei gave a small bow as well. But just because you're in the same club as my friend, doesn't mean that I'm letting you off the hook that easily. Though she did tell me that you don't speak. Well, I suppose since this was your first time running late, I'll forgive you. Just don't make a habit out of it. Sona said sternly. Tsubaki then sniffed the air and her eyes widened at the smell. Sona, this guy reeks of alcohol. Tsubaki shouted. Sona's eyes widened. She walked closer to Issei and smelled the air. Her eyes widened as well. Have you been drinking before coming to school? That is unacceptable. You're coming with me. Sona shouted, grabbing Issei's collar and dragging him with her. They reached a door. On the door it had a small frame that said, Student Council. Sona opened the door and dragged Issei inside. Sit down on one of these chairs and wait until I decide what kind of punishment I can think of. Sona said with an irritated sigh. Issei sat down on one of the chairs and waited. He probably should have washed the smell of alcohol before coming to school, but he didn't expect to run to the student council president. Let's just say that Issei put two and two together. I mean, if he ran into a random student, I doubt that they'll care enough to tell the student council, let alone anyone else. Issei then heard another sigh from Sona. He looked at her, wondering as to why she was sighing. Well, it might not be the worst punishment, but you'll have to stay after school. For now, go to the old school building. Rias is waiting for you. Sona said, sitting down on the huge desk and began to sign a few papers. Issei stood up and exited the student council. Once he got to the front door of the old school building, he narrowed his eyes, feeling two unfamiliar presences in the room. I can feel both of them as well, partner. Those two, whoever they are pretty powerful. I would advise you to be careful. Diedrag said. Issei nodded and entered the old building. He went up the stairs and took a right. He reached the door to the clubroom. He heard two voices. One was a male's that he hadn't heard of before and one of them was Rias. For the last time, Riser, I won't marry you. He heard Rias shout. This caused Issei to raise his brow. Rias was engaged. But from the sound of her voice, she was forced into the marriage. There it is again. The same refusing answer. You really are a stubborn one, Rias. The situation of your household is very serious. The man, which Issei guessed was Riser, said. And I keep telling you that as the heiress of the Grimoire family, I'll be the one to choose a husband. Both our families are rushing things. And you already know that I can't marry until I finish college in the human world. Rias said, angrily. You are right about that. But the reason that we're rushing, is because your mother and father are extremely worried. Worried that the household will go extinct if you don't marry soon enough. Your brother cannot help, since he left and became a Mao. The Great War took its toll on us devils. We lost almost all of the pure-blooded devils. Riser said. Issei then felt a crack on the door. He looked to his left and saw that an ice spike impaled the wooden door. Graphia. What was that for? Rias shouted. My apologize, Rias. But I believe that someone is behind that door. A woman's voice said. From what he heard, her name was Graphia. Issei gave a quiet sigh. Since his cover was blown, he decided to show himself. He opened the door and entered the room. He saw a man sitting on one of the sofas in the room. The man was Riser. Even though he was sitting down, Issei could tell he was tall. He was wearing a burgundy blazer with gold embroidery on the right with matching pants and black dress shoes. Underneath his open blazer is a white dress shirt that is not fully buttoned, giving a slight view to his chest. He also had short blonde hair with dark blue eyes. Issei then looked at a woman that was behind the sofa Rias and Riser were sitting in. She was wearing a blue and white maid outfit with long sleeves and a white maid headband over her head, with red lipstick. She also has silver hair and matching eyes. Her hair, which flows all the way down to her back, features a long braid on each side with small blue bows at the ends, while the rest is let down, ending in twin braids. Rias, who is this? Riser asked. This is Issei Hyodo, the current host of the Boosted Gear. Issei, this is Riser Phoenix, the heir of the Phoenix family. Rias said, though she said Riser's name like it was a curse word. I am the maid, Graphia Lucifuge. Pleased to meet you, Hyodo Issei. I also apologize for my attack earlier. Graphia said in a monotone voice, giving a small bow of apology to Issei. Issei then nodded and went to sit down. He then noticed a pair of green eyes staring at him wide-eyed. A pair of green eyes that he remembered. Issei, the girl said with a smile. Issei couldn't believe it. The girl that was sitting on the sofa was none other than Asia. Issei stared at her, wide eyes. He was wondering if this was real or just an illusion. She's real partner. Something that I forgot to mention is that devils, once recruiting a member into their peerage, can resurrect them when they are dead. You can also become a devil whilst being alive. They people that are resurrected when dead are preferred to be called resurrected devils. Diedrag said in Issei's head. Issei extended his hand and patted Asia on her head. Asia's smile widened as she closed her eyes in happiness on Issei's touch. Then Issei did something that none of them in the orc saw before. He allowed a smile to cross his face. Rias had a small blush on her face, since this was the first time in seeing Issei smile. It was, kind of relieving for her. Akino also had a blush on her face, but she also had a smile on her face. Kiba was surprised by Issei's smile, but he also smiled. Kaneko also let herself smile a little. Once Issei retracted his hand from Asia's head, he sat down and glared at Riser. Riser, though, ignored him. As I was saying, since lost most of us devils during the war, we need to replenish our numbers. Sure, some of the resurrected devils are quite powerful, but we simply cannot allow the future of the pure-blooded devils go extinct. Riser then stopped talking so that he could take a sip from his cup of tea. You can either let your house get demolished when it has continued to run for so long, or you could make an effort and save it. This marriage is the future of all devils. Riser continued. I would never let my house get demolished and I am willing to take a husband. Rias said. Perfect. Then let's go get Marie, Riser said happily, but was cut off by Rias. But you are not going to be my husband. I want to have a husband that I both respect and love. Even devils from pure-blooded families have rights to choose. Rias said. Riser then narrowed his eyes. He stood up slowly from his chair and clicked his tongue. As you know, Rias, I also carry the Phoenix clan on my back, since I'm the heir. I also don't like it when I'm forced to travel to the human world. The air and fire is a mockery to me, who can rule over the air and fire? Riser shouted. Suddenly, flames erupted from the ground, covering Riser. I will make you my wife, even if I have to burn each and every single person in this room. Riser shouted. Graphia narrowed her eyes. Before she could interrupt what was happening, she saw Issei disappearing. She then saw Riser fall out of his flames and onto the floor, a red mark visible on his right cheek. Once the fire cleared, everyone saw that Issei was the one that punched Riser. Riser gritted his teeth in anger. You! How dare you touch me, let alone punch me? Riser shouted in rage. He stood up and tried to punch Issei, covering his left arm with flames. Issei ducked the punch and sidestepped to the left of Riser. Issei then kneed Riser to his stomach. This caused Riser to spit out blood. Issei backed away from Riser. Riser fell on one knee as he coughed in pain. He looked at Issei with anger and hatred in his eyes. Both of you, enough with this. Rias, your brother suspected that things will go like this, so he offered this option. Graphia said. And what did he offer? Rias asked. A rating game between you and Riser. Graphia said. This caused Rias and her peerage to widen their eyes. Rias then narrowed her eyes. I accept. I want a way out of this marriage. Rias said. Then Riser, do you accept the rating game between you and Rias? Graphia asked, turning to look at Riser. Riser gave a cocky smile. Sure. I accept. This should be fun. Riser said. But just as he said it, he looked around the room. Rias, is this your entire peerage? Riser asked. And what if it is? Rias asked with gritted teeth. Riser looked at her and then at her peerage. He began to chuckle. That chuckle soon became a full-blown-out laugh. Ha 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 ha. This rating game is going to be a laugh. Your peerage doesn't stand a chance against my cute peerage. Riser said. Just as he said that, he snapped his fingers. His family's magic circle appeared a few feet back. Out of the circle came, girls. Issei counted about 15. What do you think, Rias? Do you like my cute peerage? You Beluna, come over here. Riser shouted to one of the girls. Yes, Riser. A woman came out of the crowd of girls. Her attire is a dress consisting of a navy blue tunic top with gold accents and a pale blue skirt with open sides, and black shoes over matching thigh-high stockings with garter belts. The top reveals much of her cleavage, and is held with a gold choker with blue and red jewels. Over this, she wears a white overcoat with black and gold accents and matching pauldrons. For accessories, she wears a black headband with a red-orange jewel over her forehead to keep her long hair in place, and wields a staff-like scepter in battle. For cosmetics, she wears purple lipstick, matching her eyes and hair. She also has wavy purple hair that falls all the way down her back and matching eyes. At the front, the right side of her hair falls over her breast and covers her right eye, while the left side falls near the top of her skirt. Riser grabbed her chin roughly and pulled her towards him. He then started to kiss her, forcing his tongue down her throat. Ubeluna was surprised with her master's sudden kiss, but she soon melted into the kiss. Riser then grabbed one of her breasts and started to play with it. This caused Ubeluna to moan. Once Riser stopped kissing his queen, he looked at Rias with a smirk. What do you think, Rias? Do you think that your peerage has what it takes to defeat me? Riser asked. Rias didn't answer, but she was staring at Riser, disgust evident in her eyes. Because this is going to be Rias' first rating game, you will have 10 days to train. Is this acceptable to you, Riser? Grafia asked. It is fine by me. But, since I want to make things a little bit easier on Rias, I'll let the host of the Red Dragon Emperor fight with her. Riser said, pointing at Issei. Riser, are you doubting my abilities? Rias shouted. Of course not. But, you yourself know that you'll need the help. Am I not right? Riser asked. Rias looked away, basically agreeing with Riser. But, he'll fight with you, in one condition. Riser smirked. Issei raised his brow, telling him to continue. He will have to battle with 2 members of my peerage. Mira, Cyrus attack him. Riser shouted, pointing a finger at Issei. 2 women that jumped from the crowd of Riser's peerage and dashed towards Issei. One of them wore a white haori with a red obi, which is worn under a red happy coat. She wears bandages on her forearms and shins, and wears black guards over her hands. For footwear, she wears a pair of zori. She also has blue hair and light brown eyes. Her hair is styled with 4 short ponytails, with 2 of the 4 pointed up and the remaining 2 pointed down. The front of her hair features split bangs going across her forehead, with side bangs framing her face. The other woman wore a white top with black accents that is modeled after a Chinese cheongsam, red shorts, and armored, knee-high boots with matching gauntlets. The top features a diamond shape on the chest area, giving view of her breasts and cleavage. She also has long black hair with a dark blue tint and brown eyes. Her hair features 5 thin ponytails going around her head, which are held up by a golden hair accessory on top of her head. Mira grabbed her wooden staff and tried to attack Issei. Before she could hit Issei, Issei parried the stick with his hand. The way he parried her caused her to lose her balance. Before she could fall, Issei punched her in the stomach. She kneeled down, holding her stomach with gritted teeth. Though the powerful punch made it difficult for her to breathe. She fell face first to the floor, unconscious. Cyrus gritted her teeth once she saw her ally fall easily. Yet again, she shouldn't be surprised since Mira is the weakest member on Riser's peerage. Cyrus grabbed her sword and dashed at Issei. She began to attack Issei with her sword, but Issei was dodging each slash with ease. Just as she was about to slash downwards, Issei grabbed her arm. He then breathed in and exhaled smoke from his mouth. But the smoke caused her to close her eyes. Issei then threw her arm aside and punched her squire in the jaw. She tried to stand up, but Issei stomped on her head, causing her to fall unconscious. Issei then looked at Riser, whose expression hasn't changed. Though he was no longer smirking. Hey. Don't let this small victory go inside your head, kid. But, you get to participate in the rating game. You should be careful though. Because if you get eliminated, then Rias loses all hope of winning. Goodbye, Rias, Riser said. His family's circle appeared from beneath him. Riser and his peerage all disappeared. I believe that it's time for me to leave as well. I'll see you in the underworld before the rating game. A red circle appeared beneath Grafia's with the Grimoire family sign on it. Grafia then disappeared. After the events that happened in the clubhouse, or the old school building, Issei and Ria's peerage agreed that in order to stand a chance against Riser and his peerage, they're going to have to get stronger. So they agreed that they will train. Rias said that there was a mansion that belonged to the Grimoire family in the mountains. She said that is where they were going to train. And so here they are. Walking up a mountain so they could get to the mansion. Issei was walking with a large hiker's bag on his back. Though it consisted of many items, Issei was able to carry it without breaking a sweat. Though he couldn't say the same about Rias and Asia. Issei, could you wait for us? Rias said, panting with her hands on her knees. Issei sighed and stopped walking. He turned around and pointed his finger at Kaneko. Rias turned around and looked at Kaneko. She immediately understood why he pointed at her. Kaneko was carrying twice the luggage of Issei with little to no difficulty. She passed Rias and made her way up the mountain. Rias sighed. My, President, it looks like you really have trouble keeping up. Akino said with a smile as she passed Rias. She was carrying a slightly small bag than Issei. Sorry, President. Kiba also said with his usual charming smile as he also passed Rias. He was carrying a bag that was the same size as Issei's. Rias then looked at Asia. She had the smallest bag out of all of them. She looked at Issei with a pout and continued to walk up the mountain. Once reaching the top, Issei looked at his surroundings. There was a wooden mansion in front of him and surrounding it was loads of trees. The weather was clear with white clouds in the sky. There was slight wind, but it wasn't strong. As I said in the clubroom, my family owns this mansion. This is where we are going to train for 10 days. Rias said with a smile. Issei waited for Rias to unlock the door to the mansion. Once she did, they entered the house. Everyone then set their hiking bags in the kitchen. Rias and the rest of the girls went to the second floor to get changed, while Kiba and Issei changed downstairs. Before Kiba could take off his shirt, he got an idea. He turned to look at Issei, only for him to widen his eyes. Issei's back shoulders were covered in red dragon scales with a few black dragon spikes. Issei, how did you become like this? Kiba asked. Issei looked at his back and then knew what he was talking about. This is what being a half-dragon does to you. Didrag said. Kiba could only nod. He and Issei put on their school gym shirts and shorts and walked outside. The girls were already there and ready, wearing their school gym clothes. Alright everyone, here is what is going to happen. Me and Akino are going to go into the deeper parts of the forest and do a magic spar, so we can see whose magic power is stronger and whose needs work on a certain category. Kaneko and Kiba, you two are going to spar against Issei. You two figure out who is going first. Asia, me and Akino are going to get to you later, so just stay here and heal any injuries, if there are any. Rias said. Everyone nodded. Seeing that everyone understood what they were going to do, Rias and Akino went into the forest. Asia went and sat down under a tree and waited for the spar between Issei and Kiba Kaneko. So Kaneko, I think it's only fair if I fight Issei first, don't you think? Kiba asked with a charming smile. Kaneko nodded and went over to where Asia was sitting. She sat down next to her and waited for Kiba and Issei to begin their spar. Issei, don't you think that you should use a sword as well? Kiba said as he grabbed a wooden sword from the wall. Issei nodded and went to grab a sword as well. Despite never training with a sword, he had an idea on how to use one, which was enough for him. He took a stance and waited for Kiba to do the first move. Kiba dashed forward with his incredible speed and went to strike Issei. Issei easily parried Kiba, and went to strike him back. Kiba also blocked Issei's attack, but it caused him to stumble a little because of the power Issei put behind his strike. Issei noticed him stumble. He repeatedly began to strike Kiba, who was blocking his attacks with difficulty. Issei delivered a low kick to Kiba's legs, causing him to fall to the floor. Issei then stood over him and raised the wooden sword in the air. Kiba parried the incoming sword with his own and managed to kick Issei off of him. Kiba quickly stood up and jumped away from Issei. I have to say Issei, your skill with a sword is pretty good. But I think that it's time I get serious as well. Kiba said with his charming smile. Kiba took his stance and dashed towards Issei. Issei raised his sword to block an incoming attack from Kiba, but Kiba disappeared. But Issei knew better than that. Kiba appeared behind him and went to strike Issei at the back of Issei's head. Issei also disappeared and reappeared behind Kiba. When Kiba saw Issei disappear, Kiba quickly turned around, only to receive a strong punch to the face. Kiba stumbled a bit, but before he could raise his guard, Issei stroked Kiba's sword with all the power he could muster. Kiba's sword left his hands and fell to the ground, 2 feet away from him. Kiba looked at his sword in shock. No one has ever managed to strip him of his sword thus far. He turned towards Issei, but like before, was met with another punch to the face, sending him crashing down. Kiba looked up and saw Issei standing over him with his sword raised, like before. Kiba shut his eyes tightly and waited for the strike to come. He heard a wooden sword dropping to the ground. He opened one eye and saw Issei that Issei has dropped his sword and extended his hand towards Kiba. Kiba took Issei's hand and Issei pulled him back to his feet. Kiba nodded in thanks with a small smile on his face. That was a good effort, Knight of Grimoire. Didrag said. Thank you, but Issei was the better man. Looks like I still have a way to go. Kiba said. True that. If I remember correctly, Rias Grimoire said that a knight has high speed, but low defense. So, the next time you spar with my partner, make sure that you focus only on blocking my partner's attacks. We will also work a little bit on your speed and stamina, but that will come in the last days that we are going to be here. Didrag said. Kiba nodded and went under the tree. Asia and Kaneko were sitting. Kaneko stood up and started to walk towards Issei just as Asia began to heal Kiba. Kaneko walked over to where Kiba was standing a few minutes ago and took her fighting stance silently. Issei remembered that Kaneko was Ria's rook and she told him that a rook is very powerful and has a very high defense. So he could expect that Kaneko is going to be a little difficult, but enjoyable at the same time. Kaneko was the first to start their fight, by running towards Issei and threw a punch. Issei caught the punch with his hand, causing a small echo to be heard and for Issei to narrow his eyes a bit. For such a little girl, she sure did pack a punch. There's a Call of Duty Zombies reference somewhere in there. Kaneko retracted her hand and tried to kick Issei, but he jumped back. After jumping back, he immediately dashed towards her, and threw a punch. Kaneko blocked the punch easily, but Issei then kicked her in the stomach, sending her to the floor. Kaneko quickly got up and narrowed her eyes at Issei. She knew that this is going to be a hard fight. So she needed to come up with a plan and fast. Issei disappeared. Kaneko looked above her and saw him coming towards her. She moved out of the way, making Issei punch the mountain, creating a small crater. Kaneko took the opportunity and punched Issei in the face. Kaneko's eyes widened. Her punch went unfazed by Issei. He didn't flinch, he didn't move from where he was and he, as you probably have guessed, didn't have a reaction. Issei raised his hand from the crater and grabbed Kaneko's wrist. She tried to pull away from him, but she was shocked once more when she realized that she couldn't. Impossible. How are you stronger than me? Kaneko asked, not able to hide her shock from entering her voice. Issei just gave a mere shrug. He then pulled her down and kneed her in her stomach. This caused her to spit both blood and spit. When Issei removed his knee from her stomach, she grabbed her stomach and fell to her knees, gritting her teeth. Issei then grabbed her by the hair and lifted her up from the ground. He then punched her in the face, sending her back down. Kaneko hasn't recovered from the knee that Issei delivered. She was coughing up blood from her mouth. Issei approached the fallen girl and put one of his knees on her stomach where he previously kneed her. This caused her eyes to go wide as she felt a sharp pain go through her body as Issei's began to put pressure on her stomach. This caused her to cough and spit even more blood. Issei then raised his left arm in the air and clenched it into a fist. Before he could bring his fist down, someone interrupted him. That is enough, partner. You don't need to beat her into unconsciousness. Let Asia heal her. Didrag shouted out of Issei's right hand. Issei frowned at what the dragon told him, but he stopped. He removed his knee from her stomach, allowing her to stop coughing blood. Issei then looked at Asia, who was looking at him with a shocked expression, a hand over her mouth and eyes wide. Issei looked away from Asia. He walked backwards and pointed a finger at Kaneko. Asia apparently got the message as she stood up from where she was sitting and ran to where Kaneko was. She put her hands over her, a green glow emitting from her ring. Issei, don't you think you could be a little bit less brutal when training with us? I know you want us to be strong, but if you are this brutal during the 10 days that we will stay here, let's just say that there may be some wounds that Asia's healing cannot reach. We don't want to fight whilst being injured now. Kiba said with a smile. Issei looked at him with his usual glare. Kiba only smiled. But Issei agreed with him. He'll tone down his brutalness a bit. After Asia finished healing Kaneko, she stood up and looked at Issei with a small frown. Issei ignored it though. So, what are we supposed to do until Rias and Akino finish their training? Asia asked. Well, something you could do is train you beneficial weaknesses. Kiba, you could train let Issei only attack you while you defend. Kaneko, as a rook you have strength and a very high defense, but you are lacking speed. So what I'm thinking is that we put a little bit of extra weight on you and have you jog for about 3 to 4 hours. Does that sound good to you? Diedrag asked. Everyone nodded, having no objections. Before they could resume their training, they saw Rias and Akino come out of the forest with torn clothes, but it was enough to cover their breasts. They also had black smudges on their cheeks. So, how was training with Issei Kiba, Kaneko? Rias asked with a smile. Well, it could have gone better for us. You could say that we got the royal Issei was a little bit more brutal to Kaneko that he was with me. Kiba said. Oh. And how brutal was he? Rias asked as she looked at Issei. Well, he kneed Kaneko in her stomach, causing her to spit blood. After that, he punched her in the face and put one of his knees to where he kneed her, causing her to spit out more blood. He was going to continue, but the Red Dragon Emperor stopped him. I also told him to tone it down a bit with his brutal nature, only when training. Kiba said. Rias looked at Issei with a disapproved look. Issei, please refrain from injuring severely the members of my peerage. We might need a lot of training in order to defeat Riser and his peerage, but beating and injuring my servants will create the opposite of helping. Thank Mao that Asia was able to heal Kiba and Kaneko, but you must know that there might be some wounds that Asia's healing might not reach. Rias scolded Issei, but repeated what Kiba said a few seconds ago. I literally just told him that, Kiba muttered with a sweat drop. Issei only nodded. But other than that, what schedule did Issei create for you? Rias asked. When I'm training with Issei, I will mostly block his attacks so I can raise my defensive capabilities. Kaneko will do jogs with heavy weights in order to get faster. She will also spar with Issei from time to time. Kiba said. Rias nodded. Asia, what we have decided, is that I want to somewhat expand your healing range and increase the power of your magic barrier. But, that will have to wait until tomorrow. It's getting quite late. Rias said looking at the now setting sun in the orange sky. Everybody nodded and made their way to the mansion. Asia said that she'll make dinner and Akino said that she'll help her. After an hour, dinner was ready. Everyone gathered in the kitchen and sat down on the table. Dinner consisted of ramen, yakisoba pan and unadon rice. Whilst eating, Rias said. This is quite delicious, Asia. I can't take all of the credit. Akino helped as well. Asia said with a blush and a smile. I only helped. Asia did all of the cooking. Akino said with a smile. Still, this is still very delicious. Kiba complimented with a charming smile. Asia only blushed from the praise she was receiving. When everyone was finished, Rias stretched and smiled. Ah, that was quite nice. Let's take a bath before we go to sleep. Rias said, standing up from her chair. The girls only nodded. Issei rubbed his left eye and stood up from his chair as well. Issei, would you like to join us in the bath as well? Rias asked with a smile. Issei looked at her with wide eyes and a small tint of red on his cheeks. He was seriously not expecting this kind of proposal. I don't mind, you know. Akino would like for Issei to join us in the bath. Rias asked, looking at her queen with a smile. My, I don't particularly mind. Akino said, liking on of her fingers with a sadistic smile. I also want to bathe with Issei. Asia said loudly while blushing. Issei could only stare at the three girls in shock. What the hell is wrong with them, letting a guy have a bath with them? Kaneko, you're the boss now. If you say no, then Issei will have to wait until we finish our bath. Rias said. All eyes were now on Kaneko. She was looking at Issei who was also looking at her. She was also blushing as she looked down and mumbled something that Issei unfortunately heard. What was that, Kaneko? Rias asked. Kaneko looked like she was overheating. Her face turned even redder than a tomato. I said, mumbled, mind. She mumbled, but only Issei heard her as he put his face in his hands. What was that, Kaneko? Akino asked with a teasing smile as she also had a small feeling on what Kaneko's answer was. Kaneko looked up a little and glared at Akino, who only laughed. But, she decided to repeat her answer a little louder this time. I said that I don't mind. Well, it looks like you are joining us after all, Issei. Rias said with a cheerful smile. Issei then removed his face from his hands and looked at them, an idea forming in his mind. Partner, you aren't thinking what I think you're thinking, are you? Diedrag asked inside Issei's head, a small hint of amusement in his voice. He looked at the group of girls with his usual glare, confusing them a little. He then started to do something unexpected. His hands went down to his belt and started to open it. All of the girls blushed at his sudden action and covered their eyes when they heard Issei unzipping the zipper of his pants. Well, all the girls that weren't Akano. She had her hands on her cheeks, covering her blush, but she was smiling as she saw Issei unzipping his pants. Issei. Please wait until we enter the bath first. Asia shouted as she went tomato face. Issei looked at her, but decided to comply. He zipped the zipper of his pants and closed his belt, allowing the girls to look at him. Well, this was clearly unexpected of you, Issei. But, I think I kinda like the teasing moves that you put on. I want to see you tease us more often. Rias said with a smile, her blush staying as she said those words. Issei only shrugged. He turned and started to walk away, but stopped when he felt someone grab him. And where do you think you're going, Issei? You're going to take that bath with us, whether you like it or not. Akano said with a smile. Issei only sighed. This is going to be so awkward for him. After the bath, Issei was lying on his bed, but he couldn't sleep. His mind was on the rating game that was coming up in the next 9 days. It was pointless thinking about it now, since they had a week to train, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. He just sighed and got out of bed. He opened the door to his balcony and looked at the full moon. The sky was filled with many stars tonight. He then heard a sigh from next to him. He turned to his right and saw Rias, wearing glasses and reading a small book. She was wearing a nightgown which mostly covered her body. It went down to her legs. She also had a frustrating look on her face. Issei approached Rias. Rias heard him walking towards her and looked at him with a smile. Ah, Issei. Shouldn't you be asleep by now? Rias asked. Issei only shrugged. The real question is, what are you doing up? And what is that book that you're reading? Also, don't devils have perfect eyesight? Why are you wearing glasses? Ddraig asked. Oh this. It's nothing really, it just helps me think better. Hey, that is proof that I have been in the human world for a long time now. Rias said with a smile. And this book contains a few things about the phoenixes, like their strengths for example. I'm looking to see if there are any weaknesses that we could use to our advantage, but sadly I see none. Rias continued with a sigh. Well, I'm not an expert on the phoenixes, but I might know a weakness of theirs. Ddraig said, catching Rias and Issei's attention. Really? What is it? Rias asked. As you know, a phoenix is practically immortal, due to their fast regeneration. But there are two things that are not immortal to a phoenix and that's his heart and mind. Ddraig said. That doesn't really help us. Rias said with a sad sigh. It actually does a bit. His heart might be a little hard, but his mind is definitely. We don't have to hurt him physically, but mentally. I'm still trying to find a way for that. Physically beating would most likely be hard. Ddraig said. Rias nodded and started to form a plan in her head. Rias, let me ask you something. Why did you not accept Riser's proposal? Ddraig asked, causing Issei to raise a brow at his unexpected question. It's because I'm a Grimoire. Rias said. I don't think I follow. Do you hate being a Grimoire? Ddraig asked. Oh no, it's nothing like that. I'm very proud that I'm a Grimoire. It's just, people look at me and say, it's Rias, the heir of the Grimoire clan. I don't want to be seen like that. I want people to see me as Rias, or more importantly, a person instead of a devil. That's one of the reasons as to why I came to the human world. They treat me more as a person instead of a devil. I never felt like that in the underworld. That's why I don't want to marry Riser. If I marry him, then he would never let me come to the human world. I would also lose my peerage if I married Riser. Rias said. Issei looked at Rias. She was still not done. As I said, the person that I want to marry is someone that will love me as me, Rias instead of the heiress of the Grimoire clan. Riser sees me as, the heiress of the Grimoire family, instead of Rias. Rias said. I understand. That's quite a good reason. Ddraig said. I know. Too bad that my family don't listen to me. Rias said with a frown. Rias then yawned and stretched. She looked at Issei with a smile. I'm glad that you were here to listen to me, Issei. Good night. Rias said. She entered her own room and closed the door. Issei yawned as well. He entered his own room and closed the door to the balcony. He lied down to his bed and sleep overcome him. 9 days later, day of the rating game, Issei was sitting on his bed at the mansion. 9 days have passed quite fast, in his opinion. Though he didn't admit it to Ria's peerage, he was quite proud of the people he trained. Kiba now had a better defense as he was able to block almost all of Issei's attacks, even some of the more unpredictable ones. Kanako's speed increased as well. Every time that they sparred, Issei made sure that she wore something heavy. Due to that, her speed increased. Issei then heard a knock on his door. The door opened, revealing Asia. She was looking at him with a nervous face. Issei, can I stay with you until we leave for the raiding game? She asked. Issei nodded and pat the empty space beside him. Asia walked over to him and sat next to him on the bed. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Issei, I'm scared, Asia said in a shaku voice. Issei only put an arm around her, hugging her and stroking her hair. Don't worry Asia, Issei will protect you if something were to happen. Also, I want to ask you something. Didrag said. What is it? Asia asked. Do you have any holy water with you? Didrag asked. That's it guys. Thank you for watching. And support the author as well for making this story.